This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 988 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. The Late Round Prospect Guide went out on Saturday night to anyone who pre-ordered, and it's obviously still available for anyone who wants to order. There's now 165 pages of information on prospects from this year's class. There's rankings, there's information on what goes into my models, and so much more. And now you get takes on all these players with landing spots in mind. So make sure to check it out over on lateround.com. Now, with the draft over, rather than immediately doing a show on my post-draft rankings, I like to take a second and just sort of analyze what we just watched. Doing the prospect guides each year now, I'm essentially in my office for 3 straight days as the draft is going on. I'm inputting draft capital into the ZAP model, I'm rewriting tons and tons of blurbs in the guide, but I'm also just taking notes. I'm jotting down some things that I find interesting as the draft unfolds. Because I always find the draft very telling. We don't get many instances during the year where teams are just openly taking action to show us, as fans who aren't part of their front office, what they're thinking. We can sit here all day and say that some team doesn't have good running back depth. But if that team does nothing to address the position in the draft, it tells us that they generally don't agree with that assessment. And that matters when we're projecting fantasy football. So again, rather than talking about my rankings today, which you can get in the prospect guide, I'll do all of that next week. Instead, I want to do some reading between the lines. I want to look at how teams actually acted during the draft to see what kind of takeaways we can find from those actions for fantasy football purposes. Because like I said, we learned a lot over the 3 days of drafting last week. So with that in mind, let's get to item number 1. This running back class was looked at as having the potential to be historically good. Now, I talked about how strong these guys looked in the ZAP model pre-draft. I was ready for backfields to be really shaken up. And while we did get that a little bit, we didn't get it to the degree that many thought. Now, one thing I do want to note here is that every single year, literally every year, going into a draft, we always think through this lens of perfection. That only the most needy running back teams will actually get running backs, while everyone else won't. That landing spots will just perfectly align from pre to post draft. That literally never happens. I think with this draft, there were some spots where we were like, okay, yeah, I can definitely see that team taking a running back early. But there were a lot of spots where we said they might take a back, maybe they won't take a back. For example, I think everyone figured that Cleveland would go in the running back direction. They had a really rough depth chart. Same with Denver. Both of those teams, they got their running backs. And then there were the probablys like the Chargers, the Steelers, the Patriots, and so on. The one team who shocked me the most who didn't go the running back direction, at least with any significant draft capital, was Chicago. Their depth chart entering the draft consisted of DeAndre Swift, Roschon Johnson, and Travis Homer. It wasn't until round 7 when they actually addressed the running back position. They drafted Kyle Monangai. And according to the ZAP model, Monangai has a ton of red flags. It's scary to not love the player when the situation is so good and the scheme should be so good, but I do question the talent profile. So DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson, they were big winners from this draft. Maybe they make a move, maybe they trade for someone, but right now, both those guys were winners in my eyes. Now, there were other teams like that too. The Bengals didn't address the position until they got a Matt Waldman favorite, Taj Brooks, in round 6. That was a decent win for Chase Brown. The Chiefs were also a team who at least had a reasonable depth chart, but they could have easily added more bodies. They didn't do anything until round 7. That's when they got the smaller pass catcher in Brashard Smith. And then the Cowboys, that's a huge one. The Cowboys had Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders atop their depth chart going into the draft. Their first running back pick was a smaller back in Jaden Blue in round 5. Then they took Phil Maffa, a massive bruiser, in round 7. Now the ZAP model does really like Jaden Blue, but it's still not a lot of draft capital to be spent on a running back. And to me, this wasn't just a situation where teams sat back and they said, oh, this is a deep draft class, we can wait on the position. I think some teams did that because we saw what happened when day 3 started. We had guys like Bashal Tutin and Cam Scadaboo go early in round 4. And then the Rams got Jarquez Hunter later in the 4th round. And then there's Trevor Etienne and Woody Marks, who got drafted in round 4 too. A lot of those teams, they likely said, okay, we don't need to spend a premium pick on the running back position. And the position is deep. So let's just wait until day 3. And then they immediately reacted on day 3. But I think this comes down to the NFL not liking these running backs quite as much as the public did. And the consensus. Consider this. Over the last couple of months, I've done a lot of talking about how I'm using NFL mock draft database's big board data. How I'm looking at where consensus mock drafts listed a player and comparing that to his actual draft capital. And using Chase Stewart's draft value chart, I can kind of find the value gained or lost by a team for a particular pick. So for instance, Caleb Johnson this year, he went 83rd overall to Pittsburgh, but the big board had him closer to 60. The difference in value there, according to Stewart's chart, was over 2 points. In this year's class, there were 6 running backs who were in that plus 2 point range, meaning teams had huge values with them. Those guys were Johnson, Dylan Sampson, Devin Neal, DJ Giddens, Damian Martinez, and Brashard Smith. And maybe you're thinking, okay, well, this is just showing you that it was a deep class, that it was a good class. And teams passed on those running backs because they knew it was a deep class. And maybe that's true. But the class we always compare this one to is the 2017 one, right? In 2017, there was only one running back with that kind of value. It was Dalvin Cook. When looking at all draft classes since 2016, which is where this data dates back to, the 2025 class had the most running backs whose teams gained 2 or more draft value points when they drafted them. And it was second when looking at teams who gained 1 or more point in value. We're never going to have a real answer to this. I'm sure the answer is somewhere in the middle. I'm sure there's something to the idea that teams kind of just go off of a big board. But there's also something to the idea that teams will just wait when classes appear deeper. I'm sure it's because some teams do that, while other teams just don't care as much. Like Sean Payton wanted RJ Harvey. The Broncos loved him. They may have reached for him based on where he might have otherwise gone, but that's how a lot of teams operate. They don't want to miss out on their guy who they think is going to make a big impact. My feeling about the 2025 draft was that it was definitely a really good running back class overall. But I think I and many others liked the class a little bit more than the NFL did when looking at things in sum. I mean, think of it this way. If teams really did just wait when positions were really strong in the draft, then wouldn't that mean that we would see more day 3 hits at running back than we actually see? Since 2011, we've averaged 1.2 day 3 running backs per class, giving fantasy managers 14 or more PPR points per game, an RB2 season. And that's in one of their first 3 years in the league, not just their rookie season. That's not a high number at all when you consider the number of running backs who get picked on day 3. If teams were just waiting to get a value, even if deep running back classes happened 5 times over the last 15 years, wouldn't we get more day 3 hits than that? What this all means, though, is that I do think there's a chance that we see more day 3 picks emerge this year, just based on my own evaluation of this class. But once again, draft capital does usually do the talking, and that's kind of scary. That, to me, was the biggest fantasy football story of this entire draft, which is why I'm spending so much time talking about it. It was this great running back class that didn't torpedo quite as many backfields as we initially thought. There were definitely some backfields that were torched, don't get me wrong. Najee Harris got huge competition, which, by the way, I warned you guys about the instant he signed with the Chargers. But Jaylen Warren got some competition, Ramondre Stevenson, the entire Broncos backfield, the Jags backfield, Tyrone Tracy, they all received decent competition. I think many thought that there might be 1 or 2 more teams added to that list. The Bears being one of them for sure. But what about the Titans, the Bengals, the Chiefs, the Cowboys? There was less movement there than expected. And it's going to be fascinating to see how some of those teams' day 3 picks, how they get elevated in rookie drafts. Now, I have my favorites, but there are some where I'm left scratching my head. There were some day 3 running back picks where I was asking myself, why didn't that team do more to fill the position? I want to get a little more philosophical with this next thing. I don't have crazy data to present to you guys with this, but I want to talk about just having an open mind as it relates to landing spot. especially when that landing spot is on a team with a brand new head coach, with a brand new regime. One great example of this is with Luther Burton, a player the Zap model loves. Now, I don't want to talk anymore about Burton the player. I probably did that too much during the pre-draft process. But Burton goes to Chicago on a team with a brand new head coach in Ben Johnson. And the initial fantasy football reaction is probably something along the lines of, how is Luther Burton going to possibly get enough work to stay relevant in fantasy with Rome Odunze and DJ Moore being locked up in the immediate future? And then the Bears just drafted Colston Loveland too, and they have Cole Kmet. How is Luther Burton going to see a decent target share? And my answer to that is, I don't know. Truly, I have no clear-cut answer to that because the math is not easy. It's not easy to get there. But what I do know is that there's a lot of variance in fantasy football. Crazy, unforeseen things, they happen all the time. And in Dynasty, you're not just playing for the upcoming season. Injuries happen, players get better and worse, they age, they get traded. So many things happen. What I want people to try to do more of when thinking about this game is detaching yourself from that individual situation and attaching yourself more to the player. And do all of that while asking yourself, why? The fact is, Luther Burton, he's a dynamic presence in the slot. And he can play on the outside too. And this is a brand new coaching staff. They have no ties to the other guys on this roster. They inherited them. Now, I'm not saying that Ben Johnson thinks that DJ Moore is bad. I'm just saying that this was an action. One of the first actions taken by this coaching staff because Burton was a second-round pick. It was an action telling us that they like Luther Burton. And they like Burton to do a certain thing for their offense. Otherwise, why would they draft him? Ben Johnson having a history with a dynamic slot player in Detroit should make you really excited about Burton's potential. I mean, even the way that he schemed up Jameson Williams should get you excited. Yes, there are players in Luther Burton's way. Yes, this could very easily turn into a better in real football kind of move. But don't weight landing spot too heavily based on only existing personnel. Essentially, I don't think you should totally fade a good player because of situation, because good players create their own good situations. And the same thing goes with Jacksonville. They've got Travis Etienne, they have Tank Bigsby. Why take Bashal Tutin? Well, Liam Cohen and his coaching staff and the front office, they're all brand new. Not only is Etienne a free agent next year, but they saw a player in Tutin who fits something that they want to do. Don't assume that he can't leapfrog what's already there, because he may fit what they want to do a little bit better. So this is just a general call out to approach all of this with an open mind. Prospect evaluation is already really tough, but you can sometimes overcomplicate it when you start overthinking landing spot. Specifically, when you overthink the competition of that landing spot. This is something that I've learned through many years of playing and analyzing the game. Landing spot can definitely dictate some of what you do. And I'll talk about where I let landing spot dictate things in literally 5 seconds. Just don't let it dictate everything that you do. I always lead with talent when I'm evaluating prospects. That's why I have the Zap model. It's why I spend 3 months of my life each year digging through data and finding relevant trends to help with talent evaluation. Now, talent is obviously on a spectrum. I think Travis Hunter and Jack Besh are both talented players, but one is clearly the better prospect. One of them is clearly more talented. So you have some talent profile, and then you have some landing spot profile. As I just talked about, I'm going to give the talent side a lot more weight than the landing spot side. But there are plenty of circumstances where I'll let the landing spot dictate where I draft a player and how I feel about a player. But this is the key. As long as there's something there on the talent side. You see, Kyle Monangai, he fell to a great landing spot in Chicago, but there are so many problems with his analytical profile. I don't think he's some slam dunk pick whatsoever. He's a total dart throw. This leads me to Denver. I'm analyzing front office decision making today. And when there's a perceived reach for a player, it tells me that either number one, consensus was just really wrong about that player, which is always possible. Or number two, that team really wanted that player. When it comes to the Broncos and RJ Harvey, I think it's a little bit of both. But Sean Payton teams don't usually spend top 100 draft capital on running backs. Friend of the show, Ryan Heath, he was on Perspectives not long ago. He sent on a tweet on Sunday that showed that Sean Payton has only drafted 4 running backs before day 3 of the NFL draft. Those 4 running backs, Reggie Bush, Mark Ingram, Alvin Kamara, and now RJ Harvey. Payton's also known for his favorable running back utilization, especially in the passing game. I talked about this a lot last offseason. His teams are consistently top 1 or 2 in the league in running back target share. Now, going back to what I was saying about talent evaluation, during the pre-draft process, I thought there were some favorable things to RJ Harvey's profile. I liked him as a prospect. His blurb in the pre-draft version of the late round prospect guide, it literally starts out by saying, quote, "There's a lot to like about RJ Harvey." He had a solid 11.1% best season reception share. That's not a red flag. He had a high-end best season total yards per team play rate. He had a really good speed score. The thing that sucked most about his profile was his age. But you could at least explain some of that away by his starting as a college quarterback, the pandemic hitting, and then a torn ACL. Now, the ZAP model itself isn't like in love with RJ Harvey because the receiving numbers, they're more average than elite, and his age is bringing him down. And with round 2 draft capital, he now has a high-risk profile. But for Sean Payton's team to make this move for what I believe is a pretty good player, this is not a situation where you'd elevate a guy who had a really crappy profile. This isn't Kyle Monangai, who I just keep destroying on this podcast, and I'm sorry to his family and him. Harvey just has a lot more favorable traits with what we look for in a fantasy back. And the fact that Denver drafted Harvey with a 2nd-round pick, that tells me that they're going to use RJ Harvey. But with the pick of Harvey and then the follow-up pick of Pat Bryant in the 3rd, it's clear that Denver just wanted their dudes. They're one of those teams that's just going to go and get their guys. Now, I wasn't super bullish on this wide receiver class. I at least didn't like the depth beyond some of the round 2, round 3 guys. And maybe that's the reason that we saw wild picks from teams in round 3 and round 4. But I'm going to go back to that mock draft data that I talked about earlier, this time with a focus on wide receivers. Since 2016, which is when that data dates back to, the ZAP model has seen 38 wide receiver selections where the NFL team who selected that player lost 3 or more points via Chase Stewart's value chart. So 38 means that there would be 3 to 4 wide receivers per class who are essentially pretty big reaches. In this year's class, there were 7 of them: Emeka Egbuka, Pat Bryant, Chimere Dike, Arian Smith, Isaac Tesla, Dante Thornton, and Jordan Watkins. What's just as crazy is that if you look at the wide receivers who lost their teams 4 or more points in draft value, we've only had 16 of those since 2016. So we get 1 or 2 of them per year. This year, we had 4. We had Bryant, DK, Arian Smith, and Isaac Tesla. I talked about this in detail on episode 977, but players who are reached for at this magnitude, especially those 4 that I just mentioned, they rarely work out in the NFL. Let me read you the other 12 wide receivers who lost 4 or more points for their teams in draft value since 2016. And again, this is comparing big board data versus actual draft capital. Ricardo Lewis, Chad Williams, Corey Davis, Deontay Johnson, Jalen Hurd, Jalen Reagor, Des Fitzpatrick, Tutu Atwell, Tyquan Thornton, Velus Jones, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Trey Tucker. I mean, that's bust after bust after bust after bust. So with this being an episode where I'm analyzing front office decision making, I'm wondering why on planet Earth the New York Jets are spending the 110th overall pick on a wide receiver who's over 23 and a half years old, who played 5 years of college football, and who had a best season receiving yards per team pass attempt rate under 1.6. What are we doing here? We can say the consensus media out there who are putting together the big board data, they're the ones who don't know what they're doing. But history says otherwise. This was a year where teams seemed to have wildly different evaluations on lower tiered wide receivers because it showed up in the draft. Now, speaking of wide receivers, there were 2 wideouts taken in round 1 to teams who probably weren't like at the top of the list to take a wide receiver. At least one of them weren't. And that's with Emeka Egbuka and Matthew Golden. What do those picks really tell us? Let's start with Golden. I actually think Green Bay taking a wide receiver, which they finally did in round 1, makes all the sense in the world. The Packers lost Christian Watson to an ACL at the end of last year. He's not going to be available for most of 2025. And Watson is also in the last year of his rookie contract. Meanwhile, Romeo Doubs, he's also on the last year of his contract. Dontavian Wicks can separate, but he's had trouble with his hands. And the Packers clearly see Jaden Reed as just a slot receiver. At least that's how they've deployed him. So I love the fit with Matthew Golden for a lot of those reasons. He has analytical red flags, and I talk about that in the prospect guide. But strictly from a position and from a fit perspective, Golden made a ton of sense for Green Bay. He can be a perimeter threat and give the Packers more flexibility when they see a potential makeover next year with their wide receiver room. Now, the Emeka Egbuka pick, that was a little bit more puzzling. Chris Godwin just got a new deal with the Bucs. That pointed to me about them feeling good about his health. They already have Mike Evans, obviously, and then they drafted Jalen McMillan last year. One thing I want to say about the Bucs is they seem to prioritize the high leverage positions more than other teams do. Wide receiver, that's a position that not only can help a football team in a big way, but it's a position where dollars also follow. So getting talented players at a position like wide receiver who are on rookie deals, that's a big value to teams. Another thing I want to say about the Bucs is that it doesn't seem like they value individual wide receiver roles. What I mean by that is they took Jalen McMillan last year, and he was a slot player in college. They then didn't use him in the slot last year at all, even when Chris Godwin went down. Emeka Egbuka, he's a slot player too. That's how he profiles. Now, I think he can also play on the outside. He was actually quite good on the perimeter in college, according to yards per out run. But most would say that he's most comfortable in the slot. So now you look at the wide receiver room and it's Mike Evans and then 3 wide receivers who profile best out of the slot. Godwin's also getting older and coming off an injury, so I don't think that role is really going to change for him. The funny thing is, the Bucs also spent a 7th round pick on Tez Johnson, the quintessential slot guy in this class. So I'll say from like a fit perspective, it's a little bit strange. With that being said, I'm of the belief that Egbuka is a really, really talented prospect. He had the 2nd best breakout score in this class according to the Zap model. He posted that kind of production on a team with crazy wide receiver competition. The Bucs are also probably thinking a little bit like the Packers. It's just not as obvious. They want flexibility with their pass catchers. Mike Evans is a free agent next year. They're probably just wanting to add talented players to a team that could at least look a little bit different or have a chance to look different in 2026. And obviously, Mike Evans is closer to the end of his career than the beginning of it. The situation with Egbuka reminds me a lot of what we saw with Jackson Smith-Njigba just a couple of years ago. It was hard to see how he'd get production, but like I said earlier, things change quickly in Dynasty. Situations are not forever, and that's why I'm still willing to draft Egbuka in rookie drafts, because his Zap score was really close to Tet McMillan's, and to the model, he is the wide receiver 3 in this class. He's categorized as an elite producer. You just may have to be a little bit more patient with him. The Houston Texans drafted not just 1, but 2 day 2 wide receivers. And they were wideouts who played for the same team in college. Jaden Higgins was their round 2 guy. Jalen Knoll went in round 3. I said it this offseason, but I saw Higgins as a pretty high ceiling, low floor player. Knoll was one of my favorite pre-draft values out of the slot. The 2 of them combined would form an awesome wide receiver. But Higgins actually got a Nico Collins statistical comp in the Zap model. It was funny to see him land in Houston because of that. At first, I thought, hey, maybe Matt Harmon's recommendation of Higgins being more of a power slot could really come to fruition because Nico Collins is there. And when that pick happened, I actually texted Harmon about it. But then a round later, they drafted Jalen Knoll, who's a slot guy first and foremost. And that's on a team that traded for Christian Kirk earlier in the offseason. Now, I think this all signals a few things. Number 1, teams can always use wide receivers. So anytime a team goes and gets a wideout when it seemed like they didn't need one necessarily, like the Jalen Knoll pick, don't be surprised. It's a valuable position. Number 2, Jaden Higgins being on a team where he's not asked to be the alpha is probably a good outcome for him. There are a lot of misses with bigger bodied wide receivers in round 2 over the last 15 years. But some of the biggest hits have been from players who weren't asked to be alphas right away. In fact, since 2011, there have been 16 second round picks who are 6'3" or taller and weighed 210 or more pounds. Half of them gave fantasy managers 13 or more PPR points per game in one of their first 3 years. The sustainable hits were Alshon Jeffrey, Michael Thomas, Courtland Sutton, DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, and T. Higgins. So many of those players weren't asked the world when they got to their destinations. A lot of them played alongside other established wide receivers. Courtland Sutton had the late Demaryius Thomas, and then he also had Emmanuel Sanders. Alshon Jeffrey had Brandon Marshall. DK Metcalf had at least Tyler Lockett. T. Higgins had AJ Green and Tyler Boyd, and then eventually, obviously, Jamar Chase. So I don't see Jaden Higgins playing with Nico Collins as a bad thing at all. I think some would view it as a really great thing, like Harmon in his reception perception charting. Meanwhile, Jalen Noel could play the slot immediately if he beats out Christian Kirk. But even if he doesn't, the Texans are not tied heavily to Kirk. I still think it's possible that Noel has a better and more productive career than Jaden Higgins. Just if sort of like the lower percentile outcome hits for Higgins, which again, it's a volatile situation for him. These moves also unfortunately point to unfavorable things for Tank Dell. He wasn't expected to do anything in 2025, but it's still sad to see injuries derail such a promising start to a career. But that's how I viewed that double dip of wide receivers for the Texans. And one big winner from this draft, CJ Stroud. Now look, I don't have a model for quarterbacks, and I think evaluating them is incredibly difficult. So much of the position has to do with what's going on between the ears. And we as fantasy managers, we're in mom's basement. We're not interviewing these guys. What I will say about Shedeur Sanders falling in the draft is that usually when something like that happens, when there's this huge perceived value at quarterback by a team, it's a bad thing. I saw a tweet from Jack Lichtenstein that was retweeted by Hayden Winks on Monday that showed the biggest steals at quarterback over the last 10 years based on big board rank. Essentially, all the stuff that I talked about at wide receiver and running back today, but for quarterbacks. And if you look at the biggest values, almost none of them have worked out. Like, it's insane. When quarterbacks fall further than expected in the draft, at least in recent history, it's telling us that these teams don't think those quarterbacks are good. Teams are saying that over and over and over again. And for the record, this is why reaches usually get more signal analytically than values. Because think about it. When a player is a value, it means that he's falling down draft boards and teams are passing up on that player over and over again. So we have tons of different inputs. We have team inputs, and those teams are telling us that that player isn't worthy of that draft selection, which means that front offices are screaming at us that he's not as good of a player as we thought. When there's a reach, we don't really have that kind of information because one team just really liked that guy. We don't know if the rest of the NFL really felt that way. But let this serve as a word of caution. Players who fall like Sanders fell have not worked out at a high rate whatsoever. At quarterback, we actually see better hits from reaches. Now, I want to end today's show by just talking about one sleeper who I'm targeting in every rookie draft. And it's a day 3 running back who I think many will be turned off by because number 1, it's a day 3 back, but number 2, he looks completely buried on his depth chart. Now, keep in mind, we're terrible at projecting which day 3 running backs are going to hit in fantasy football. I talked about that on episode 980. But I literally celebrated in my office when the Rams took Jarquez Hunter in the 4th round of the draft. He was my go-to sleeper running back pre-draft. Now, some of you are probably curious as to why. You look at the Rams, you see Kyren Williams, you see Blake Corum, and they drafted Blake Corum higher than they drafted Jarquez Hunter this year. Why draft Hunter given that landing spot? Well, we know Sean McVay loves Kyren Williams, but Kyren Williams also took a step back last year, and he's now in his final year of his rookie contract. He's a free agent next year. Meanwhile, is Blake Corum that good? Honestly, we don't have an answer to that. But what I can tell you is that Jarquez Hunter looks better in the ZAP model when you remove draft capital from the equation. Hunter had a 93.8 breakout score. That was one of the best breakout scores in the class. And compared to the rest of the class, he was 5th in career avoided tackles per rush, 9th in career explosive run rate, and 9th in career yards after contact per attempt. And unlike Blake Corum and Kyren Williams, Hunter actually has a really good speed score. It was 105. Corum's was 97, which is below average, And we all remember Kyren Williams running a terrible 40 back when he was drafted. The single knock, in my opinion, on Hunter was his size, or at least one of his bigger knocks. He's 5'9", 204 pounds. But that's exactly what the Rams have been drafting and using in their offense. If there's one NFL coach who's willing to give a slightly smaller back a 3-down workload, it's probably Sean McVay. Look at what he's done with Kyren Williams. I think this move was to get yet another running back who profiles like Kyren Williams and Blake Corum into this offense. Because when you have sort of like duplicates of the same guy in an offense, and I'd argue there's far more explosiveness with Jarquez Hunter. But when you have duplicates like this, it makes it harder on a defense to really know what's coming. Because offenses can rotate these running backs by drive instead of rotating them based on down and distance. That's a nice advantage to have. Now look, there's a very real chance that Kyren Williams sticks around LA and doesn't move on next year. But if he does, I see no reason why a talent like Jarquez Hunter can't leapfrog Blake Corum. He's a very good and underrated prospect. And to me, this is kind of the perfect dart throw in rookie drafts. But that's it. Those are my general thoughts on how some of these front offices were thinking during this year's draft. I've got takes on every relevant player in the prospect guide, and we'll have months to dissect these new situations. It's just good to kick things off this way to see if there's any competitive advantage that we can find in our rookie drafts. Next week, I'll talk through my post-draft rookie rankings. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And you have to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Now, with all the work that I just did with the draft, I'm taking a long weekend with my wife to go relax for a little bit. So later this week, instead of a Perspectives episode, I'm going to throw a Rewind episode into your podcast feeds. An older evergreen episode that's still relevant today. Now, I'll be sending a newsletter out this week, so make sure you're subscribed to the newsletter for absolutely free by heading to lateround.com. Go ahead and do that when you go purchase the prospect guide. But genuinely, thank you guys so much for supporting my work with the Late Round Prospect Guide. I really, really, really appreciate it. And I hope you really enjoy it. I hope you get a lot out of it. And thanks for making this year's NFL Draft another fun one. Honestly, I can't wait for next year's already. I'm the luckiest guy in the world to be able to do this, and I have all of you to thank. Have a great week.